Kurt Wise took me from one fascinating place to another, showing me evidence of fossil forests, explaining the rapid formation of coal, and talking about the complex design of biological systems. Everywhere we turned, he showed me something new about the Earth and its history. We ended up at the entrance to an old abandoned coal mine.
This is leftover remains of the Dayton Coal and Iron Company, built about 110 years ago.
Well, what's amazing is if you didn't know that history, and if you looked at these rocks, you would think they were very ancient. In fact, if we were in Greece, we might think they're thousands of years old.
It's hard to tell just looking at the structure itself.
Well, Kurt, then I need for you to do something to me, because I know that the conventional paradigm looks back in Earth history, and it's a straight line, a lot of uniform processes and so forth. But the Genesis history is telling us that it's not that uniform.
Yeah, that's a good point. In 2 Peter chapter 3, it talks about people in the latter days saying, where's the promise of this coming? For all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. That concept that what you see in the present, what's happening right now, what's happening in the creek down below, what is happening in every place on the earth, is the way it's always been. It's always been for all of Earth history. The passage goes on to say, for this they are willingly ignorant. They're not just ignorant of these truths, they're purposely rejecting these truths. And it lists the creation and the flood. These are apparently events, according to the Bible, that aren't like the present.
Right.
And the neat thing is, that's what we see here. That cliff isn't actually in place. That cliff belongs about 1,000 feet up. It's slid down to its current location. That's a pretty big boulder.
That's huge. That's
okay,
massive.
Now what kind of process in the present slides blocks that big down? This thing continues for a mile. But inside those rocks are yet further evidence of an event before that that's even bigger, even more unlike the present. And then inside those rocks are also fossils of a time period that's very different than the present. So that, according to the claims of Scripture and according to my own experience, you can't use the present to judge the past, to understand the past. But if you go all the way back to the beginning, you realize that the Bible lays out what I would call epochs of Earth history.
Major periods of time.
Just different things happening during each of these epochs, that if you lived in any one of the other epochs, you would never understand the previous epoch, because it's so different. The first one is the creation itself. In 6 days, God created the entire universe. He created the planets and the stars, and he stretched out the universe with his outstretched arm. That's obviously not happening today. He's not creating planets. In fact, at the end of that passage, he says he ended his creation work. Then we move into what I call the Edenian epoch, the period of time when Adam and Eve are in the Garden of Eden. And it's very different than the present. We get the impression from that passage, for example, that Adam and Eve, if they had not sinned, would have lived forever. It's hard to even conceive of human beings living forever. So it's a different world, wildly different. How long it lasts, we don't know, but it suddenly terminated with Adam and Eve eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil,
rebelling,
and God cursing the creation. He changed the rules in the universe. Now no longer is the sun going to be able to burn forever. No longer are we going to be able to live forever.
So it's hard for us to even imagine what that would be like, because we only see the laws are...
And we wouldn't have come to that conclusion if we didn't have the Word of God.
We didn't have this...
And that's what I think the Word of God has been given to us for. So we slide into the third epoch of time, what I call the antediluvian period, the period before the flood and after the fall of man. It's a world that's different than the present. It's got the same natural laws going on, but it's a different set of critters, different set of plants. It's a little bit warmer Earth. The continents are in different positions from what they are now. It looks significantly different.
Well, that's what we see in Peter, where it talks about that world being destroyed. So the flood was not just soaking everything. This is radical change, wasn't it?
Yeah, if we're right about what we've understood so far, we got continents moving, smashing together, creating mountains. Mountains are rising to tens of thousands of feet. You've got water washing across entire continents. we're ripping thousands of feet of sediment off of the old continents and then depositing thousands of feet of sediment on top of them again.
Yeah.
We're looking at earthquakes of astonishing power.
So this change then from what you call the antediluvian epoch now into the post-flood.
Basically, the Earth has got to recover from a global flood. The atmosphere's got to recover, the geology, the rocks have to recover, plants and animals have to spread across the Earth. You got lots of water, humongous earthquake, humongous volcanoes, and more or less that period of recovery is a slow decrease in intensity and frequency of those things.
So would it be in that period that we would see the Ice Age, for example?
Yes, that's ironically, the Ice Age turns out to be, in our modeling, a consequence of the heating of the water during the flood. Water is evaporating off the oceans, that cools the oceans. The water is then moving over the continents and dropping enormous volumes of water. Now, in certain places, the rain's going to come down as snow, but coming down so rapidly and without break that it can't melt and accumulates into thick sequences of ice until they're miles thick. And then when the oceans had cooled enough that rain generation system had stopped, then those glaciers then collapse under their own weight, melt back to the current position, and they're continuing to melt. You know, this thing, global warming, it's recovering, the Earth is still recovering from the flood.
So that was really a fairly tumultuous era right then, but then you have one final epoch.
So the modern epoch is, you can study present processes and understand things fairly readily back to within a couple centuries of the flood.
And so that would lead one to think that these processes, if you take them all the way back.
Precisely.
Right.
You take the present processes and extend them into the back. And that's what 2 Peter says. That's the error people make. It's reasonable. Take the present and extend it into the past. Not unreasonable. So you need to go to the Bible to find out the necessary information to reconstruct it. And looking at it the other way, if you start from the Bible, you only get the beginning of the story.
Right.
God has given us the ability to read the rocks and fill in the rest of the story. And we need to fully understand the flood, we start with the Bible, but then we go to the rocks. Speak to the rocks and they shall tell thee what has happened in the past.
Kurt made a good point. The Bible records historical events, but it doesn't explain how those events happened. That's what these scientists were doing. They were trying to interpret the evidence in light of biblical history. But Kurt said there was evidence inside the rocks. What was that evidence?
I love coming to natural history museums. For me, as a paleontologist, it's like the chance to go to a zoo. It's all the animals that used to live before the flood. It's like a chance to step back in time.
It is like a zoo, except they're not alive.
They're all dead. And they don't smell, so that's pretty good. And the Natural History Museum isn't just about telling us what was there. It's also trying to give us a storyline, right? And we've got two possibilities. We've got these two paradigms between a naturalistic view and a biblical view. And all the natural history museums in the country, most of them around the world, all give you just one of those views, only giving you the naturalistic, old Earth view of the world. But these same data, this dinosaur, is able to be understood in an alternate paradigm. So when I'm thinking about these types of creatures, I'm thinking about a world that's right before the flood.
I mean, this is a real picture of a violent world.
That's why God said, behold, the end of all flesh. It wasn't just mankind. Man and all of the animals over which we rule are judged at the time of the flood.
Well, Marcus, can you kind of give us an overall picture of the fossils and how all this stuff fits together?
Yeah, fossils tend to be found in distinct layers where there are very, very large numbers that have been destroyed, untold billions. And so every time we see a layer of rock that's this thick, we're thinking about an event that probably took minutes to make, not thousands of years, minutes for just this one package of rock, sometimes even seconds, where these pulses of water from the flood are moving over the continents, grabbing ecosystems or dragging marine ones up from deeper in the ocean. and pulling them onto land. And as one gets deposited and the waves come back, they start pulling and piling additional stuff on top of that. And it's a graveyard on top of a graveyard on top of a graveyard. It's the sort of thing that speaks to catastrophe, not the sort of thing where the fossil record is gradually accumulating bone by bone, shell by shell, little by little, over untold eons of time.
So you're saying that we have these marine fossils all over, even on mountains?
Yeah. You know, further back over in the museum, they've got sections with things like mosasaurs, these big swimming reptiles. Mosasaurs are globally distributed, and they're distributed on continents. So looking at these things, you're saying, what is it that has the power? What is it that has the capacity to take the marine world and throw it on top of the continents in such a violent and destructive manner? And the flood makes perfect sense for this.
When we were in the Grand Canyon, we saw that great unconformity.
Yeah.
And there were no fossils to speak of really below that. And then all of a sudden we start getting a lot. What does that say to you as a paleontologist?
Well, the great unconformity is telling me that there's some sort of massive erosion and shearing that's happening across the continent. And then once we start getting to those nice sedimentary rocks that have all the wonderful fossils in them, the pattern starts to emerge. The ecosystem that has the first animals in it shows up very suddenly. In conventional paleontology, they call this the Cambrian explosion. It's the first appearance of a wide diversity of different types of marine animals. All of a sudden, you have this complex and whole ecosystem that shows up basically out of nowhere. Now, that makes perfect sense from a creation and flood perspective because the flood is about destroying ecosystems. Whereas in an evolutionary view, these ecosystems are going to have to arise a little bit more gradually as organisms diversify and evolve and respond to one another in their environment. But that's not what you see. Instead, you see an explosion of life that is complex, whole. The ecosystem is integrated with one another. You can see where all the different organisms fit with respect to one another. And that's just the first time that that happens. Every time you move up in the geological column, in this fossil record, you start seeing snapshots of more and more ecosystems. You've got one ecosystem that's destroyed, and then you've got another one. It's got slightly different creatures, there's different interactions going on, and as the floodwaters move higher and higher, they're getting closer and closer to shore, destroying more and more organisms in the shoreline and eventually up onto land.
Yeah. So I think I see what you're saying here, and that is that the paradigm that we're all taught, that conventional paradigm, is trying to tell us that the fossil record is an evolutionary picture of life as it is developing, as opposed to the Genesis paradigm that's saying, no, all of that life, all the complexity of life already was there, and now we're looking at the graveyard of all that life.
Exactly.
Well, what are some of the other data that you're seeing that convinces you of this paradigm?
Sure. Well, one very curious situation with the fossil record, so thinking vertically about things, is not the hard parts of the animal, but the trackways. They're the footprints. This is a pattern that we see in several different groups where their footprints are first and their body parts are later. For the trilobites, for the amphibians, for the dinosaurs, the first time I find evidence of them in the fossil record, it's from trackways, not the hard parts. From an old Earth perspective, that's really weird and hard to grapple with because you have millions of years between the trackway production and ultimately the animal that made it. But that obviously doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? Because if there's trackways, there's animals, and those animals have bones and teeth and shells to them. Why aren't they fossilized? Instead, the pattern is telling us something different. There's no time between when somebody leaves a track and when somebody gets buried.
But the fact that those trackways are still there, that should tell us something as well, shouldn't it?
One, it tells us that the deposition or the placement of the next layer on top of them had to happen very, very quickly. Because again, you go out onto a beach and you walk in the sand, your trackways are destroyed very, very quickly. But the fossil record is showing us something very different from today. This is death in a moment, right? This is death in an instant. And we're talking about a world that was complex, whole, integrated, and the flood is destroying that world sequentially and burying it in a vertical fashion. And so I think looking at the fossil record as a record of life is partly correct, but it's not about life's development. It's about life's attempt to survive an event that ultimately consumed all of them.
Well, that would make sense then, because when God was talking about destroying the earth with the flood, it wasn't just the destruction of human life, it was the destruction of all life.
And so now the world we live in is, as you said, radically different than what that was before.
Yeah, when we look at the T-Rex, when we look at the mosasaurs, when we look at all these animals as ferocious carnivores, and they really are, I mean, they're terrifying, but that's not what they were initially created to be. And so these sharp teeth, these devastating claws, and the behaviors that go along with them all seem to be part of the curse. And part of that is genetic, part of it might also be just some modifications, but these organisms, by the time we see them, and this is important for us to remember when we come to a natural history museum, is you're not seeing the world at Creation Week.
Right.
You're seeing the world as it existed at the flood. And that world was one that was filled with violence and was a pretty terrible place to be.
I realized that the billions of creatures buried in those layers are a silent testimony to God's global judgment. I decided I wanted to see one of those layers of fossils for myself. If the dinosaurs had died suddenly in the flood, wouldn't it be obvious?
What we're dealing with here, this is in the Lance Formation. This is a Upper Cretaceous sedimentary deposit. And what we have here is what's called a bone bed. It's an accumulation of bones that's about 1 meter thick, a little less than 1 meter. And in this meter, we find the bones present as a graded bed with little bones at the top and bigger bones at the bottom. And you can see here, looks like Caroline is working on another vertebra here. This is a cervical vertebra of a duck-billed dinosaur. This is where the spinal cord goes, right there. When I look at these bones in the quarry, I often think of them as being inside the animal alive, and just imagine what it's like to be seeing these bones for the first time. So this is just full of bones, and it's not like we have to go looking for where the bones are. We just have to sit down and start digging.
What is mainly different about the sites that you're digging here as opposed to what we would say a general dinosaur dig somewhere?
Well, there are dinosaurs found all over the world, but this particular site is unique in that it's probably one of the largest collections of bones in the world. And there are the remains of I'd say between 5,000 and 10,000 animals, each 20 to 40 feet long in this deposit. These are big animals, and there are a lot of them.
Let's step back for just a second. Okay, so we had a duck-bill dinosaur roaming around the earth, and all of a sudden it dies. Would it become a fossil?
Fossilization requires very special circumstances. Normally, we know, for example, if a coyote dies out in the desert, its body is soon gone. Yet these bones are all perfectly preserved. They have never been subjected to weather. They are just all there. Today it would be very difficult to imagine how you could do that.
To some extent, we would really say that to find a fossil is rare. Even though we have many, many fossils, in terms of things that die, it's rare if they become fossilized.
It is rare. It requires special circumstances, not the least of which is rapid burial. These animals had to die, and then their carcasses had to have time to rot. So we're talking days or weeks or months, during which time the bones and tissues were either eaten away or rotted away. And then the bones that remained were deposited instantaneously in this environment, because they're in a graded bed with big bones at the bottom and little bones at the top. And you can see that here. The big bones are all down at the bottom. And when they start digging up here, they start to find smaller bones. So that condition requires a sorting process that can only take place during a catastrophic emplacement.
So when we look at the dinosaur fossils, rather than looking at them from the standpoint of we have early dinosaurs, then middle dinosaurs, then later dinosaurs, you're looking at from the perspective that all those dinosaurs were in existence. They were all living, and then there was this huge catastrophe that brought them to an end.
The dinosaurs are already dinosaurs when they first appear. They look just like anyone would think a dinosaur looked. And this is an enigma for those who believe in the evolution of the dinosaurs.
But we hear a lot about transitional forms. What's the real story there?
Scientists have been able to lay out some forms they think are transitional, and some of them are very interesting, some even challenging. But they are the exceptions to the rule. The rule is there are no transitional fossils. And what we find in the fossil record, and contra to Darwin's hopes, this is the rule, is that a form exists in the fossil record. It basically stays unchanged, and it disappears from the fossil record without having been changed. That's got to mean something besides evolution, because we don't ever see changes from this form into this form in the rocks themselves. So it's coming from somewhere else. It's a paradigm that's being imposed on the data rather than the data providing the paradigm. So I think it's very easy for me to be a creationist just based on my understanding of the complexity of life forms. And when we look at the fossil record, we can see that complexity is all there from the beginning, and this begs the question of where did all this complexity come from? It's one thing to have faith. I have faith that God was the creator, but that's substantiated by what I see around me. To say I have faith that evolution produced this when I can't even see how it could have happened, that's blind faith.
That's a leap in the dark.
That's a leap in the dark.
It seemed that everywhere I looked, there was a growing body of evidence that fit the historical record of Genesis. It wasn't just one thing, it was many things pointing in the same direction. When I was with Art, he told me about some recent discoveries of material inside dinosaur bones. So I traveled to a lab in Arizona to talk to a scientist who is doing some of that research himself.
This is a fragment of a Triceratops horn. When we pulled it out of the ground, it fragmented, and then of course we've had to continue to fragment it in order to do analysis of it. In 2012, the Creation Research Society sponsored Mark Armitage and I to go to the Hell Creek Formation in Montana, which is a very popular place for finding dinosaur bones. And we instead dug out a almost 4-foot-long Triceratops brow horn. Now, it's just in crumbled pieces now, so we can't really, put it together and show you a horn. But yeah, you have to recognize that pieces such as this, we have found tissue with cells.
Oh, that's amazing.
And potentially proteins such as collagen. It's so difficult to understand how you could have this material still in a dinosaur fossil that is supposed to be 65, 75, 80 million years of age, because tissue, cells, proteins break down. They're not concrete, they don't just exist for eons of time, they break down. And in fact, they tend to break down fairly quickly depending upon the conditions. And certainly in Hell Creek, the conditions would be warm up, cool down, warm up, cool down. And any biochemist can tell you that is the fastest way to destroy material. It's difficult enough to envision it surviving for 4,000 or 5,000 years, but 60 million years, 70 million years, see, that really becomes very difficult to make any kind of biochemical basis for how it could have survived.
Okay, so once you find a sample like this, what do you do next?
So what we do is we soak the fossil material in a solution called EDTA. And what you'll have after you dissolve the fossil is the tissue will be remaining because the EDTA won't dissolve the tissue. So then I'll bring this over to what we call a dissection microscope. This is, in essence, dissolved Triceratops horn magnified. And so you can see what it looks like, just kind of little pieces of rock.
Well, Kevin, what did you find then when you were looking at the sample and you actually found some tissue?
Okay, here's what we found. This is actually Triceratops tissue. It's stretchable, it's pliable, it's not an impression of the soft parts of the dinosaur. This is truly soft, it is squishy, it is stretchable, it is tissue.
That blows your mind, huh?
Absolutely. And if you look at them then at a closer magnification, what we see then, this is using scanning electron microscopy, you see the extreme detail of the cells. See, in that picture, and this picture, and particularly look at this picture, we would not begin to expect to see such enormous and elaborate detail. I mean, these structures are incredibly small. You know, this is our 20 micron bar here. See how small these structures are, still intact. It would take very little to break those. So at best, you would expect that all that would have broken off and been long gone.
So that has to have shaken up the scientific community. What's been the response of all of this?
The initial response, when Dr. Schweitzer first published her work, which is what became very popularized in 2005, it generated a lot of response. And so initially some of the reaction was rejection. Oh, it's contamination. You know, that's not really dinosaur. It's bacteria, because bacteria can look kind of strange sometimes. So you had a lot of proposals of what it could be. And to her credit, Dr. Schweitzer did more work. They began to find protein. You break open some of these cells. You look at the matrix these cells are attached to, and they're protein.
Okay, so once that is understood,
yes,
then what happens? Now this is shaking it up, I guess.
That becomes part of the controversy, because clearly you're now faced with how could you explain the survival of this, the pristine survival of this, not only for so long, but in very unpristine conditions. And so then the controversy has been, how do you explain it? And if you read some of the literature, there's almost like desperation because they recognized what the implications of this could be. Now, some people would claim, well, it means nothing because we know how old they are, and therefore it just means it survived somehow, big deal. But how do you know how old they are? Well, you use methods, supposed methods of dating. Well, this is a method of dating. The tissue itself can't be discounted as part of a method of dating. So why do you say that doesn't count, but this does count? Well, it's all the paradigm drives your conclusions. The paradigm is it has to be old. Therefore, methods that give us an old fossil are what we choose. Something that doesn't give us an old fossil, like tissue, we have to reject or explain away.
At least to me, and of course I'm not a microbiologist, but I think most people would say, well, that just seems reasonable to think that maybe these are not that old.
Clearly, this is in violation of the dating process. It challenges the entire dating process. If the fossils of dinosaurs have been dated incorrectly, which I would say this is clear evidence they have, then it's very likely the fossils of any organism have been dated incorrectly, and therefore then the geologic ages themselves are incorrect.
What you're saying is that if you pull out the notion of a long period of time, you're pulling out a major foundation for the conventional paradigm.
Absolutely. In fact, time is the critical component for evolution. If you're going to say that a simple cellular system became a multicellular system that then became fish, and the fish then jumped up on land and grew legs and started breathing air, and then that creature grew feathers and wings and started flying. So if you give us time, we'll claim to account for all of this massive change of organisms, but we got to have the time.
Everything seemed to come back to the question of time. I remembered Andrew saying that Charles Darwin accepted millions of years first, then fit his theory of evolution to that assumption. But why is time such an important element to evolution? Rob Carter is a marine biologist, so he took me scuba diving to get a glimpse of a world most people don't see. His specialty was coral, and he knew a lot about the incredible creatures that inhabit the reefs around St. Thomas.
Oh man, we got the sharks here. I mean, just look how they move. I mean, it's almost like effortlessly glide along. I wish I could swim like that.
Engineers wish we could make boats like that.
Yeah.
Submarines that could move as efficiently as a shark. We can't quite do it.
So from your perspective as a marine biologist, and I know that you've studied the whole area of genetics a lot.
Yes.
When people talk about evolution, what is it?
How do you define evolution? The word means change over time. But I believe in change over time. but I'm not an evolutionist. So how does one figure this out? Really, evolution is a belief that enough change over enough time, can lead to the common ancestry of all species on Earth.
All right.
So that's the part I reject. Of course species change. I mean, look at these sharks here. We have several different species of sharks. When God created, he put into those organisms the ability to change, to adapt, to respond dynamically to the environment. But they're still sharks. And when we look at the fossil record, they're still sharks. You know, people have heard the phrase the missing link. And they usually think of between man and monkeys. No, there's missing links between almost every major group of animal and almost every other major group of animal and plant, even bacteria, throughout the entire fossil record, which indicates very strongly that these are actually different creations.
So we don't get one kind becoming another kind.
No. Evolutionary theory requires that small, random changes can explain everything we see. But it can't.
And why can't it?
Because life is so complex that small changes can't explain it. Just like you can't take a computer operating system and look at it and say, oh yeah, this is built up one digit at a time over any length of time. No, it took an intelligent person to sit down and put it together.
Well, I can guarantee you, as one who was in that world, that if anyone in the area of computer science were to say, if we just randomly change some things in this operating system, it'll get better. I mean, no one would agree with that.
No, we're not going to get the shark to evolve into a bird. That the number of changes and the types of changes are not something that you can do one change at a time. This is a sea urchin.
It looks spiny.
It's pointy, you gotta be careful.
Am I going to get stuck if I touch it?
No. He's pointy, but...
Oh my goodness, they're moving.
Yes, they're moving. And in between the spines are little tube feet, especially on the bottom. Oh, look at that movement. So he walks with his spines, but he's little tube feet in here, and that's what he uses to grab onto things. But looking carefully, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There are actually 10 radial parts to this animal. Actually, the starfish is his cousin.
Are you serious? You can't be serious.
Absolutely. The starfish here is also an echinoderm, but notice he has 5-fold symmetry instead of 10.
Yeah?
This starfish does. On the bottom, look. We see the spines, we see the tube feet. His mouth is in the center there.
So there is some similarity here, even though externally it looks a lot different.
A lot different. Actually, you want to see something that looks a lot different?
Sure.
Which is a cousin to the starfish and the sea urchin?
All right. It almost looks like a rock.
Yes. I gotta be careful. He's squirting on me. This is a sea cucumber.
Oh, big.
He has spines. He has tube feet.
Oh my goodness.
You would never know it until you studied really hard that this also is an echinoderm. He's not very happy being out of the water, so let me put him back in.
Yeah, so these are all related, even though they look very, very different.
Related in their creation. Not in an evolutionary sense, but our creator took this phylum of life, the echinoderms, and created this and this and this on a similar pattern. And that's what we see across the entire realm of life, similarities and differences.
So what makes them different?
Well, genetically, they share most of their genes in common, but there are developmental genes. They're called Hox genes that set up these patterns in the animal as it develops. They develop from a single cell. In one of them, they set up a 5-fold symmetry. Another, they set up a 10-fold symmetry. Another one, they make this long, skinny animal. They control the development of the embryo in these amazing ways.
So what you're saying, when we look at this from a molecular or genetic perspective, what we're finding is really a fascinating design in all of that.
Absolutely.
But what we've heard in the conventional paradigm, the conventional story tells us that it's those random changes that has brought about all of this.
Sure. Back in the 1800s, when life was simple, when they didn't know what was happening inside the cell, they didn't know how complex genetics was, you could imagine all sorts of things. But now that we know what actually happens behind the scenes, the story gets a lot more complicated. You see, I like to say the genome is 4-dimensional. Well, we have a 1-dimensional string called DNA. And if you want to draw that out You'd have to write all the letters of DNA out on all 3 billion of them, and then you have to draw lines or arrows from one part to another part because this part turns this part off, this part interferes with this part enhances this. It's this huge two-dimensional interaction network. And that's where you have a two-dimensional genome.
I mean, let me stop here for a second because this is really amazing to think about this because I think in terms of a computer program that it's fairly static. I mean, the instructions are there, but you're talking about a program that is reprogramming itself.
Oh,
it's modifying its own instructions.
Oh, wait till I get to the 4th dimension.
Oh, okay.
Because of the 3rd dimension first. The information in that first dimension, that linear string, has to be organized in such a way that when it falls into the 3rd dimension, it still works.
Oh, that's amazing.
Genes that are used together are next to each other in 3D space.
Are you saying that once this thing gets folded up, it's almost like we have a new set of instructions?
Yes, a new level of information.
Unbelievable.
That whoever programmed that first level needed to understand what was going to happen, have it work in the 3rd level.
But you said there's another dimension even.
Oh yeah, the 4th dimension is time.
And how does that work?
The genome changes shape over time. Maybe you eat something that's bad for you, and your liver says, I can get rid of that toxin. Now, the chromosomes in the liver will change shape, expose that new protein gene, make copies of it, build a brand new protein that can kill off that toxin, and when it's not needed anymore, they'll change shape again and fold back.
Oh my goodness.
Dynamic programming. All 3 levels change in the 4th level, time.
Rob, that's so far beyond anything that we know, even in our most complex software systems, that it's almost beyond imagination to think that someone would look at that and say it all happened by chance.
Yes, and it only brings glory to God.
It does.
You can't build something like that up one thing at a time. You need it to function. In all this interlocking 4-dimensional complexity, it's not something you can do one letter at a time with natural selection.
Mm-hmm. It all has to be there.
Yeah, in the same way when we talked about the environment out here on the coral reef, if you don't have all these interlocking pieces of that puzzle, you don't have that ecology. The system will come crashing down if you just remove a couple of very important factors that are there. They have to be together or it doesn't happen.
So not only did we have this interdependency, this mutualism, so to speak, down at the genetic level, now we even make it more complex by saying there is that same mutualism at the higher level as well.
Yes. In fact, the entire world has a mutualism.
It's impossible to think that all of this could have happened just by a series of slow processes over billions of years.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
It's clear that the world we live in is incredibly interdependent, from the smallest biological system to the largest ecosystem. There are complex mutual relationships everywhere. I realize that creation in 6 days makes the most sense from an engineering perspective. You need everything working together at the same time for everything to function properly. And that's exactly how Genesis says God created it. Rob also said God created animals with the ability to change and adapt to their environments. Is it possible this ability to change has been mistaken for evolution?